Chaos. My interest in what's actually called dynamical systems theory
Lo que me interesa en lo que se llama teoría de sistemas dinámicos,
of which the field, the mathematics, known as deterministic chaos,
en el campo en el que los matemáticos llaman determinismo del caos o caos determinista,
is one of the underlying principles behind this dynamical systems theory.
es uno de los principios que subyacen en estos sistemas dinámicos.
And rather than get really detailed or bogged down in the mathematics,
Y más que adentrarme en esto y entrar en las matemáticas,
and I'm not a mathematician,
y no soy matemático,
so while I could talk about it, I would, if anybody here knows more than me, I'd be very happy for them to
si alguien sabe aquí
take
más
over.
que yo al respecto de esto, estaría muy contento de que...
So instead of doing that,
Entonces, en vez de hacer esto,
I'll talk about the piece last night.
voy a hablar de la obra de ayer.
My particular interest in that mathematics
Mi interés específico en lo matemático
is that, first of all, it is the mathematics that underlie ways of looking at much more complex systems in nature than we have been able to in the past.
es la matemática que nos permite ver sistemas más complejos ahora que los que podíamos ver antes.
The classical model of physics, of course, Newtonian physics,
El modelo clásico newtoniano de la física
concentrated on basically what's called simple harmonic motion, periodic motion.
se concentraba en lo que podría llamarse movimiento periódico,
And whatever in nature couldn't be described,
y cualquier cosa que dentro de la naturaleza no podía ser descripta
with those mathematical tools,
dentro de estas reglas matemáticas,
was just essentially ignored.
básicamente se ignoraba. Más que reglas,
No,
herramientas matemáticas.
It was just classified as, it's chaotic, you know. It doesn't fit. Well, fractals play a part in that. Since the turn of the century, when the principal figures,
Al comienzo del siglo, las figuras
Was-
principales,
Poincaré, the mathematician
el
Poincaré,
matemático Poincaré,
who was one of the first people to understand
que fue uno de los primeros en entender
that this kind of simple periodic behavior was insufficient to describe actually most of the things it pretended to describe.
que de alguna manera estos sistemas simples de descripción de los comportamientos no eran suficientes.
One of the classic examples of that
Uno de los ejemplos típicos de esto
is the work of the physicist Rob Shaw,
es el trabajo del físico Rob Shaw,
who did this classic work in dynamical systems theory,
que hizo un trabajo muy importante, que es un clásico en sistemas dinámicos,
demonstrating that a dripping faucet,
demostrando que una canilla goteando
is not periodic,
no es periódica,
but is actually a form of chaotic oscillator.
pero es una manera de oscilador caótico,
Meaning that over a long period of time and observation,
lo que quiere decir que en un largo periodo de observación
there are slight deviations from periodic behavior
hay pequeñas desviaciones de los comportamientos periódicos.
that, while not being periodic,
Mientras no son periódicos,
still have a definable structure.
todavía tienen una estructura definible.
And the mathematics for dealing with these complex deviations of behavior over long periods of time,
Y las matemáticas para medir estas desviaciones a lo largo de este largo periodo de tiempo
is what we refer to as deterministic chaos.
es a lo que nos referimos cuando hablamos del caos determinista.
Be simple about it.
Para tratar de ser simple sobre esto,
What the mathematics shows, if you take enough data over a period of time,
lo que las matemáticas nos muestran cuando analizamos esto a lo largo de
and
un
there's
largo periodo de
very
tiempo,
specific terminology to talk about this, where we talk about behaviors within a phase space.
Hablamos de comportamientos dentro de un espacio en fase,
and you can chart this in very many dimensional states.
y se puede hacer un mapa de esto de alguna manera niveles distintos.
And when you do that, there are these mathematical objects which appear.
Y así, cuando hacemos esto aparecen objetos matemáticos.
And computer visualization is the perfect tool to deal with that.
Y la visualización con las computadoras es un ejemplo muy bueno para esto.
And these mathematical objects that appear are extremely structured
Estos objetos que aparecen están extremadamente estructurados
and extremely beautiful.
y extremadamente hermosos.
There's a set of equations. We talk about, oh God, I'm sorry.
It doesn't matter, it was 20 years ago when I learned something.
3 types of what we call attractors,
Hay 3 tipos de lo que llamamos atractores,
which are these mathematical objects which can be visualized.
estos objetos matemáticos que podemos visualizar.
We talk about single point attractors.
Hablamos de atractores que están en un único punto.
There are, what's the other one called? I always think of it just in terms of toruses. Wait a minute, I knew I was going to be asked this. What's called a limit cycle.
Lo que se llama el ciclo límite.
And the third classification, all these have fairly predictable behaviors.
Más o menos estos dos tienen una especie de comportamiento predecible.
And the third of these is what are called chaotic attractors,
Y el tercero es lo que llamamos atractor caótico,
which are highly structured but highly unpredictable.
que son altamente estructurados pero altamente impredecibles.
And you may have seen pictures of some of these. The simplest one is what's called a Rössler attractor. Looks like a
Ustedes
donut.
pueden haber visto alguna imagen de esto.
And
Una
it
de
has
las más simples es el donut, no sé qué es.
torus,
Forma.
a torus.
Ujú.
And it has these various behavioral points that exist within this phase space. I mean, we could get
Bueno.
very detailed, but to try to bring it back to what's relevant,
Para tratar de ir a lo importante,
there's a set of equations called Lyapunov equations,
Hay algunas-
exponents, which are a set of equations
hay un grupo de ecuaciones
that, when they have positive values,
que cuando tienen valores positivos,
they describe these chaotic attractors.
de alguna manera describen estos atractores caóticos.
And it would appear at first glance, or when people first become acquainted with these kinds of mathematical
Y
objects,
la primera vez que miramos estos objetos desde el punto de vista matemático,
and in the early days of chaos theory,
no, las primeras veces que se observó esto y los comienzos de la teoría,
it was believed that these were specific states,
se creía que estos eran estados específicos,
almost like archetypes that would reappear.
casi como arquetipos.
We now understand that there's probably an infinite set,
Ahora entendemos que esto es un conjunto infinito
and you can chart those or plot those through these Lyapunov exponents and equations.
y uno puede hacer un mapeo a través de ecuaciones.
What I was doing last night
Lo que yo estaba haciendo anoche
was creating what is called hyper-chaotic behavior
era lo que podría llamar un comportamiento hipercaótico
in a very high-dimensional state,
en un estado altamente dimensional,
where under perturbation, under influence,
bajo la influencia.
I can push the system through these various attractor states.
Yo puedo llevar esto hacia los diferentes atractores, estados de los atractores.
So you're hearing almost a trajectory or traveling through different zones of chaotic behavior.
Lo que ustedes estaban escuchando era como un viaje a lo largo de estas zonas de comportamiento caótico.
What underlies it is the construction of 2 chaotic circuits.
Lo que está subyacente es la construcción de dos circuitos caóticos
Chaotic, that can be coupled, can be, what you saw me doing was mostly just simply opening and closing switches.
Básicamente lo que yo estaba haciendo era encender y apagar obturadores,
And I have a set of presets, a very strange concept.
que es un concepto muy extraño.
So at its core, there are simply 3 sine wave oscillators.
En el centro hay 3 ondas sinusoidales, perdón, osciladores.
And these are interconnected with some other factors and components
están interactuando con otros componentes
to create what we call chaotic FM,
para crear lo que nosotros llamamos un FM caótico.
of which classic FM synthesis
La típica definición o síntesis del FM,
is a subset.
subset,
Es un subset.
Yeah.
Es un subconjunto.
ajá, es un subconjunto.
So the familiar FM synthesis
La síntesis familiar
is just simply one small area that's
Es-
contained within chaotic FM.
es una pequeña área que está contenida dentro de este circuito.
Secondary to the part that actually are the two chaotic circuits here
Ahí tengo los dos circuitos caóticos.
is a simple ambisonic circuit. Ambisonics is a technique for sound spatialization.
Hay un circuito abajo ambasónico
Ambisonics.
o ambisónico.
And it's a very simple technique
Es una técnica muy simple
that just deals with relative phase relationships.
que de alguna manera tiene que ver con fases
Sí.
relacionadas.
Relativas, las fases relativas de los
Relativas.
sonidos.
What is interesting in this application
Lo que es interesante aquí
is that the chaotic behavior also drives the phase changes within the ambisonic circuit.
can you repeat the last part? Can you repeat the last part?
The chaotic
El
behaviors
comportamiento caótico, los
that are
comportamientos
generating waveforms,
que
pitches,
están generando alturas, ondas sinusoidales,
rhythmic elements,
elementos rítmicos,
also is determining spatial placements of the sound.
también está determinando la ubicación del sonido.
Quadraphonic.
It was quadraphonic. That's what you hear now, except we're also doubling it through the back speakers. So, the interface
La interfase
is very simple,
es muy simple.
and most of the time I'm just simply, the zones of chaos that I've chosen, which I have 13,
La mayoría de lo que casi siempre hago, yo he elegido 13 zonas,
are just 13 possibilities out of an infinitude of
son
possibilities.
13 posibilidades dentro de posibilidades infinitas.
They constitute the compositional choice I've made,
De alguna manera son la opción compositiva que yo he hecho.
in that these zones of chaos, in their sequence,
Y estas zonas de caos y
are my
sus
decisions.
secuencias son mi decisión,
but there could have been an infinite number.
pero podrían haber sido innumerables.
It's
So-
not sound, no? It's mathematical. That chosen, that 13 chosen. It's mathematical that you choose. It's not sound.
Once
And
the
instead of
circuit,
recorded.
once the circuit is constructed,
Una vez que he construido el circuito,
I can push it through infinite behavior.
lo puedo arrastrar hacia comportamientos infinitos.
And out of all of those possibilities,
Y de
I
todas
just
esas-
prefer these
de
13.
todas esas posibilidades, yo simplemente prefiero estas 13.
Yeah,
I could make another piece
No, I
with a
understand.
different
But
sequence.
I mean, this 13 is mathematical option for make sound. It's not sound by itself. I
What
mean,
I think-
pre-recorded sound is no. It's chaos mathematical.
Oh, yes,
to
it's,
produce sound.
you're hearing it's being created in real time.
Ah,
Esto
that's
fue
it.
You're
creado
not
en
hearing a
tiempo real.
recording,
Okay.
you're not hearing samples.
No se están escuchando samples, no se está escuchando.
You're hearing behaviors of sound
Se están escuchando comportamientos de sonido
based on the mathematics of chaos.
que se basa en la matemática del caos.
So it's occurring as you hear it.
Está ocurriendo como al mismo tiempo que lo escuchan.
Pero hay una fórmula básica que él usa para disparar todo,
Do you have a basic formula to display all this?
to produce
A mathematical formula to show?
a motor, an initial motor.
That's the chaotic circuit,
Uh-huh.
is the engine that drives the
El motor.
behavior.
That's a mathematical formula.
You could reduce it to one.
Ah, you don't create a formula.
No, no. The nice thing about an analog computer
Lo bueno de una computadora analógica
is that because it's analog,
es que justamente porque es analógica,
has infinite resolution
tiene posibilidades infinitas
and infinite possibilities.
y conclusiones también.
And by just simply perturbation, control is simply the matter of turning a knob,
Y es simplemente una cuestión de, bueno, encender o apagar un
as
botón,
opposed to creating a simulation of chaos in digital code.
en vez de hacer una simulación del caos en código digital.
And that's what I mean. It's a virtual representation,
Por eso es que dije que es una
a digital
representación
representation of analog computing behavior.
virtual del comportamiento virtual de las computadoras.
Which, if you're confused, so am I.
Si estás confundido, yo también.
So let's listen to some. So an initial state. So I'm doing nothing. I've changed the coupling between these two circuits. Very subtle change.
Hice algunos cambios muy sutiles.
A different zone of chaos. So the important thing to understand here is that this is a behavior, a mathematical behavior.
Lo que es importante entender aquí es que este es un comportamiento matemático.
I'm not controlling any of the details,
No estoy controlando ninguno de los detalles.
but if I now go back to that first state,
Pero si vuelvo al primer...
whoops, it shuts the thing off. You'll notice that it's the same.
Y ven que es lo mismo.
So its details never repeat,
Estos detalles nunca se repiten,
but there's a macro, a global behavior,
pero hay
a pattern,
un patrón, un comportamiento global
which is recognizable even though the specific details are never the same.
que se puede reconocer aunque los detalles específicos nunca son los mismos.
So again, the second one. And because of the nature of these attractors,
Y por la naturaleza de estos,
they can get locked into a basin of behavior,
de alguna manera pueden quedar como encerrados en un tipo de comportamiento,
which is more or less interesting, sometimes not interesting.
que a veces puede ser interesante y a veces no.
Which is, when I open and close these switches, my task is to push it.
Cuando yo enciendo estos botones, lo único que intento es empujarlos
And slightly change its behavior.
y medianamente modificar su comportamiento.
It is answer change.
Pardon?
When you switch on or switch off, you don't know what kind of change is producing.
That's
the
right.
pattern.
That's right. Another zone. Now, if you'll notice, when I go to these zones, these knobs all switch to different values.
Todos estos botones van a empezar a tener valores diferentes. Wouldn't you get to know after a while
Yes.
when you start
Yes.
manipulating for a long time?
And as you play with this for, in my case, a year,
Si uno está con este material durante un año,
you do have a sense of these zones of behavior.
empieza a haber un sentido de estas zonas de comportamiento.
And while they are completely unpredictable, they are also very familiar.
Y aunque son completamente impredecibles, terminan siendo muy familiares.
Yeah.
When you use pseudo-random operators, there is something called the seed of the generator that allows you to reproduce random behavior, random
Uh-huh.
set of numbers. Are you using something like this?
Yes, there are random number generators involved in this, and what they are doing is simply changing slight incremental values for these Lyapunov exponents. So the positive values that are inserted are very small incremental changes. You know, fractional, tiny incremental changes.
Pequeños cambios que son prácticamente fraccionales.
And that's enough to suddenly shift it into a whole other basin of attraction.
Y eso es suficiente para llevarlo a todo otro campo de posibilidades.
And it's all based in the third kind of chaos attractive that you told, no? Not central attractive, not too attractive, but what do we call mobile attraction.
An actual chaotic attractor. The first two, single point and the toroidal ones, are not chaotic. They basically are attractors that in dynamical systems theory describe, for the most part, single point. You're describing periodic behavior. It's the third one where this class is this classification of this immense range of, that we now understand most phenomena in nature. It's just that now we understand that what we couldn't explain through periodic physics, we now have the tools to get a handle on.
Bueno, entiendo, ¿no es cierto? Que lo que ahora podemos explicar a través de la física,
Lo que no se podía
lo que
explicar
antes
con
no
los
se podía
modelos.
explicar con los modelos,
Claro.
ahora se puede entender a través de la física.
Go back to the concept of chaotic FM.
Uh-huh.
It's like doing FM with random oscillators.
To some extent, you can actually achieve chaotic FM
Se puede
on
lograr-
traditional analog synthesizers,
se
like a
puede-
Buchla synthesizer.
Maybe it's better if you just say that in English. They don't understand.
Uh, and it's very easy to do with traditional analog computers, because that's really all the traditional synthesizers are. They're a form of analog computer. That's what they are. And it's kind of an interesting thing that musicians were exploring all of this stuff. In fact, at the same time that artists were exploring video feedback. One of the other areas of classic work in dynamical systems theory is the work of Jim Crutchfield, which is video feedback is a form of chaotic behavior. And in fact, I can show you pictures. This kind of behaviors that anybody who ever played with video feedback would generate. Classic form. This is in fact what Jim did his PhD in, was video feedback as chaotic behavior. So you can achieve that. The advantage of a system like this is you have much more range and specific. You can lock yourself into these kinds of zones in a way that the slight drift of oscillators in something like a Buchla synthesizer, just the slightest drift in terms of chaotic FM is completely catastrophic. Meaning in the rate of change of the chaotic behavior is immense by just a slight drift. Whereas this simulation, digital simulation of analog behavior, you can really lock into these really wonderful types of behaviors.
It is strange to continue calling chaotic, no? Feedback, or chaotic.
Yeah,
Because it's not more
yeah,
chaotic.
which is why the term deterministic chaos has been adopted, because it describes it in a more specific, it differentiates it from the Greek word, yeah. Everybody exhausted? So I'm happy to answer more questions, but did that
Si quieren hacer más preguntas.
did that help?
Thank you very much.
Is that what you were?
Sure.
Okay.
Just
Okay.
hear more.
Okay. So, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
No, thank you. You were very good with
You were that microphone.
He's recording.
Estás grabando la.
Out of the question.
Uh-huh.